He didn't go there to save anything. He went because the weather forecast said -23, and he needed to check the fence line before the pipes froze again. That was how Garrett found the dog. The property sat on the edge of Algonquin country, just outside a small town called Merritt Falls, the kind of place in Ontario where the main street still had a hardware store and a diner that closed at 2 in the afternoon, and nobody thought anything strange about that. Garrett Phelan had bought the 40 acres 3 years ago with the insurance money and what remained of his pension, and he had told himself at the time that the solitude was the point, that he needed quiet, that after everything, the deployments, the funerals, the long silence that had settled into his marriage like winter into stone and finally taken his wife too, what he needed more than anything was a place where nobody would knock on the door. He had gotten exactly what he asked for. The fence ran along the eastern property line through a stand of jack pine, and the snow that afternoon had come in sideways off the lake, the kind of cold that turns your exhaled breath into a small cloud and then erases it before it can rise. Garrett moved through the trees with his head down and his collar up, stepping over the drifts with the automatic efficiency of a man who had learned early in life that the body knows things the mind has already given up on. He heard the sound before he saw anything. It was not a bark. It was more like the sound a hinge makes when the metal has rusted through, thin and strained and somehow embarrassed by its own weakness. Coming from somewhere low to the ground, somewhere off to his right, behind the deadfall at the edge of his neighbor's abandoned pasture. He almost kept walking. He stood still for a moment, his breath coming out in small pale clouds, and listened. The sound came again. He changed direction. What he found behind the deadfall was a dog, or what had once been a dog before someone decided it wasn't worth the effort. A husky mix, maybe 2 years old, maybe 3. It was hard to tell. Black and gray and white, with one blue eye and one eye the color of pale amber, curled into itself in the hollow beneath a fallen spruce, shaking so hard Garrett could see the tremor from 4 feet away. A frayed length of orange bungee cord had been looped around its neck and tied to a branch that had broken off some time ago, leaving the dog with about 2 feet of movement in any direction. Someone had left it there. Not today. Maybe not even this week. Garrett crouched down in the snow and looked at the dog, and the dog looked back at him with those 2 mismatched eyes and did not make a sound. Not anymore. Whatever sound it had made before had cost it something. He pulled off his right glove and reached into his jacket pocket for the folding knife he'd carried since 2003, and he cut the bungee cord. The dog didn't move. "Okay," Garrett said. He had not spoken out loud in 4 days. His own voice surprised him. Rough at the edges like something unused. He picked the dog up, all of it, bones and fur and shivering, and tucked it inside his open jacket against his chest, and he walked back through the trees toward the house. He thought he was doing the dog a favor. He didn't know yet that the favor was mutual. The nearest vet in Merritt Falls was a woman named Dr. Paulette Osey, who ran her practice out of a converted bungalow on Lakeshore Road with a hand-painted sign out front and a waiting room that smelled like antiseptic and old magazines. Garrett had never been inside before. He had driven past it many times, the way you drive past things in a small town that you know exist but have no reason to enter. He entered it the next morning. Dr. Osey looked at the dog for a long time before she looked at Garrett. "How long was it out there?" she asked. "I don't know. At least a day in those temperatures. Maybe more." She pressed her stethoscope to the dog's chest, and her expression went very still in the way that medical professionals learn, the kind of stillness that is actually controlled concern rather than the absence of it. The dog lay on the steel examination table and did not struggle and did not make any sound. Just watched, those 2 mismatched eyes moving between the vet and the man who had brought it in, as though trying to work out the mathematics of trust. "She's malnourished," Dr. Osey said. "Moderate hypothermia, some frostbite on the ears and paws. But the lungs are clear. Heart's strong." She paused considering, Garrett said. "She's going to need quiet warmth, small meals frequent, nothing rich." Dr. Osey looked up at him. "You keeping her?" Garrett looked at the dog. The dog looked at him. "I haven't decided," he said. Dr. Osey made a sound that was not quite a laugh but held the shape of one. "Well, let me know when you do." He drove home with the dog wrapped in the emergency blanket from his truck's kit, riding in the passenger seat with her head against the door, not looking at him, just watching the snow-covered fields move past the window. He had not had a passenger in 3 years. The first week was practical. That was how Garrett approached it. As a logistics problem, the way he had been trained to approach everything that threatened to have feelings attached to it. The dog needed a sleeping place, so he put an old wool blanket in the corner of the kitchen near the wood stove. She needed food in small amounts, so he drove into town and bought the food doctor Ossie had recommended from the feed store on Main Street, and the young man behind the counter named Teddy, who was maybe 22 and had the cheerful uselessness of someone who has never had a difficult day, said, "She's a Husky mix?" "Those are great dogs, man. Very loyal." And Garrett said thanks and paid and left. He named her Frost. Not because he thought it was a good name, exactly, but because it was honest. Because that was where she had come from. Because he had learned a long time ago that naming things after what they survived was a form of respect. Frost did not respond to the name for the first several days. She ate what he put in front of her, slowly, carefully, like someone who had learned not to trust abundance. And she slept near the wood stove and she watched him. That was what she did more than anything else. She watched him. Garrett was not used to being watched. He had spent 3 years becoming invisible, which is a thing you can do in a rural area if you want to. If you keep your errands short and your eye contact minimal, and you never linger anywhere long enough to become a presence someone might miss. He had gotten good at it. He had, if he was being honest with himself, begun to confuse this invisibility with peace. Frost watched him make coffee in the morning, and she watched him eat his meals, standing over the kitchen sink, and she watched him sit in the armchair in the evening with a book he rarely actually read. And after 3 days of this, Garrett began to notice something uncomfortable. He was watching her back, not in the monitoring way of those early days, checking her breathing or the color of her gums as Dr. Ossie had instructed. Something different, something more like attention. Like actually looking. He couldn't remember the last time he had looked at anything that carefully. His nearest neighbor was a retired schoolteacher named Beverly Marchetti. Bev, she insisted. No one called her Beverly except her sister, and her sister was in Thunder Bay, who had lived in the farmhouse a kilometer up the road for 31 years, and made a point of checking in on new residents in a manner that managed to feel like friendship rather than surveillance, which was a social skill Garrett recognized as considerable, and did not himself possess. She appeared at his door on a Sunday afternoon about 2 weeks after Frost arrived, carrying a covered dish and wearing an expression of such uncomplicated warmth that Garrett found it briefly difficult to know what to do with his face. "I heard from Paulette that you'd taken in a dog," she said. "I made too much shepherd's pie again. Roy used to say I cooked like there were 8 people coming to dinner, even when it was just the 2 of us." She smiled. "Roy's been gone 6 years. You'd think I'd have adjusted the recipe by now." Garrett opened the door wider. Bev came in and noticed Frost immediately. The dog had risen from her blanket near the wood stove and was standing very still, watching the visitor with those pale, mismatched eyes. "Oh," Bev said, and her voice shifted into something softer and more private. "Oh, look at you." She crouched down without being invited and held out one hand, palm up, not reaching forward, just offering, and Frost stood there for a long moment before taking one step toward her, then another. She sniffed Bev's fingers and then, with a kind of deliberate dignity, turned around and went back to her blanket. "She's still deciding," Bev said, straightening up. "She does a lot of that," Garrett said. Bev put the shepherd's pie on the counter and looked around the kitchen, not nosily, just taking it in, and then looked at Garrett in the same measured way, and he had the uneasy feeling of being understood without having explained anything. "You were with the Navy?" she asked. "Long time ago." "My son did 2 tours in Afghanistan," she said. "He's in Calgary now, teaches high school gym. He got a dog too after." She paused. "He says the dog was the thing that made the quiet feel different, less like something waiting." Garrett looked at Frost. "Yeah," he said. "I think I'm starting to see that." The ice went out of the lake in early April. In Merritt Falls, this was an event. People drove down to the waterfront to watch, which Garrett found faintly absurd until Bev invited him to come along and he went. because it turned out that refusing invitations consistently was beginning to require more energy than accepting them. He stood at the edge of the parking lot with his hands in his pockets and Frost on a new leash he'd bought from the Canadian Tire in the next town over, and he watched the lake ice crack and shift and begin its slow disaggregation with a sound like distant thunder. Frost had never seen open water. She pressed against his leg and watched the ice moving, and her whole body was rigid with attention. And Garrett put his hand on her back without thinking about it. And she didn't move away, and he didn't move his hand. Around them, people he didn't know by name were saying things about the winter being long this year, and hoping it meant a decent summer and pointing at things. A man with gray temples and a Raptors jacket whose name Garrett later learned was Dale Ferris, who had farmed the east side of the county for 40 years and spoke in a slow, deliberate way that made everything he said sound like it had been considered before being issued, stopped and looked down at Frost. "She yours?" Dale asked. "Apparently," Garrett said. Dale smiled. "What's her name?" "Frost." Dale looked at the dog and then at the lake and then back at the dog. "Good name," he said, "for a place like this." Frost turned and looked at Dale for a long moment with those two mismatched eyes, and then she sat down, which she had never done on command, had never done on leash, and Garrett realized afterward that she had done it because she had decided Dale was okay, that it was safe to be still. He thought about that for the rest of the walk home. There were still hard nights. He wasn't going to pretend otherwise. There were nights in April and May when he woke at 2 in the morning with his heart already running, and the bedroom feeling like a place where something bad had just happened, and the 3 seconds between sleep and consciousness were the worst, because in those 3 seconds he was always back somewhere else. Kandahar, or the cargo bay of a transport aircraft, or the hospital corridor in Halifax where the doctor had come out with her face already arranged into a kind of gentle armor, and he had known before she said a word that Claire was gone. His wife, 12 years married, an aneurysm at 44, fast and absolute and without the mercy of warning. He used to lie there in those 3 seconds, and then the next 3, and then the next, and feel the emptiness of the house pressing down. But Frost had started sleeping at the foot of the bed. She had migrated there gradually. From her blanket to the doorway to the end of the hall too, finally the oval rug at the foot of the bed, and on those hard nights what happened now was different. He would feel the weight of her at the foot of the mattress, or hear the small sound of her breathing, and the 3 seconds would end. Not joyfully, not dramatically, just end. The way bad weather ends, not because something wonderful has replaced it, but because weather always moves on eventually. He started sleeping better, not perfectly, better, and he started noticing other things. The way Frost had begun to meet him at the door, not frantically, not with the theatrical enthusiasm of a dog in a commercial, but with something more contained. A rising of the ears, a slight shifting of weight from back to front, a look that he had come to recognize as distinctly hers. The look that said, "You were gone and now you're not, and that matters." He started coming home on purpose, had started timing his errands so there wasn't too much distance between them. He would have said, if pressed, that he was managing her schedule. Anyone who knew him well enough to press him on it would have recognized this for what it was. It was Teddy from the feed store who caused the thing with the garden. Garrett had gone in for Frost's food in June, and Teddy, who was incapable of a transaction without a conversation, mentioned that his grandmother had given him a flat of tomato seedlings he didn't know what to do with because he lived in an apartment, and did Garrett have any use for them? Garrett said he didn't garden. Teddy said it wasn't really gardening, it was just tomatoes, and put the flat on the counter, and Garrett looked at it for a moment and then picked it up and put it in the truck. He planted them along the south-facing wall of the barn where the sun hit longest. He didn't know entirely why. He found a trowel in the shed that must have come with the property, because he'd certainly never bought one, and he dug the holes in the dirt while Frost sat beside him and watched with the serious attention she brought to everything he did, and when he finished and stood up and looked at the 12 small plants in their uneven row, he felt something he couldn't quite name. Not happiness, exactly. Something more structural than that, like a door had been opened in a house you'd thought was sealed. That evening he called Bev. She answered on the second ring. I planted tomatoes, he said. There was a pause. That's wonderful, Garrett. I don't know why I'm telling you. Because you wanted to tell someone, she said. That's not a complicated reason. He stood in the kitchen with the phone, looking out the window at the barn where the seedlings were not yet visible in the dusk. And he thought that she was right, and that there was something simultaneously uncomfortable and necessary about that. About wanting to tell someone. About having someone to tell. You should come see them when they're growing, he said. Bring Paulette if she wants. We'll come, Bev said, and I'll bring bread. The first time Frost barked was in late June. Not at a threat, not at a stranger, at a woodpecker. The bird had landed on the corner post of the garden fence. Garrett had added a fence after a rabbit incident in early June that he preferred not to dwell on, and was attacking the wood with extraordinary conviction, and Frost had been watching it from about 3 meters away with increasing intensity, and then, without any obvious change in her expression, she barked. A single, clear, genuinely surprised bark, like it had come out before she'd had a chance to decide whether to issue it. She startled herself, stepped back 1 pace and looked at Garrett with an expression that, on a human face, would have been embarrassment. Garrett laughed. He had not laughed. Actually laughed, not the polite social version, but the real involuntary kind, in so long that the sound surprised him the way it had surprised Frost. It came up from somewhere genuine, and it was over quickly, but it was real. And he stood there in the summer garden with the woodpecker flying off in irritation, and Frost watching him with those 2 pale eyes, and something in the air between them shifted. She took 1 step toward him, then another. She pressed the side of her face against his hand. He stood there and let her. He had been a Navy SEAL. He had done 3 tours. He had held men as they died, and he had come home and held his wife as she died, and he had believed, in the years after, that what was left of him was mostly function, the ability to eat and sleep and maintain the property, and stay alive in a technical sense, which is not the same thing as living. He had believed that because it was easier than believing the alternative, that the parts of him that could be reached were still there, still capable of being reached. Frost pressed her face against his hand, and he put his other hand on her, and the woodpecker was gone, and the tomatoes were growing along the south wall of the barn and somewhere up the road. Beverly Marchetti was going about her Sunday, and somewhere across the county, Dale Ferris was doing whatever farmers did in late June, and the world was turning in its ordinary way, and Garrett Phelan stood in his garden in the late afternoon light and understood that he had been wrong, that the alternative was true. Dr. Ozzie saw them in August at the farmers' market on the waterfront. Merritt Falls had a small one on Saturday mornings, 3 tables and a woman who sold preserves and a teenager with honey, and she stopped in front of Garrett and looked at Frost and then at Garrett and said, "She looks completely different." "Yeah," Garrett said. "Her coat's grown in, she's a healthy weight, and she looks—" Dr. Ozzie searched for the word present. Some dogs that come through what she came through, they stay somewhere else inside. "You know what I mean?" "I do," Garrett said. "You both look different, actually," she said, which was possibly the most direct thing anyone had said to him in years, and which he chose to receive as a compliment because it was clearly intended as one. He bought 2 jars of preserves. He didn't need them, but the woman at the table was in her 70s, and had driven 40 minutes to be here, and that seemed like it deserved acknowledgement. He gave 1 jar to Bev when she appeared 10 minutes later with a canvas bag, and the unrushed warmth that was simply how she moved through the world. Dale was there too with his wife, a small precise woman named Irene, who raised her eyebrows when Frost sat down next to her shoe as if offering an opinion, and laughed and said, "I think she likes me." "She picks who she trusts," Garrett said. "She doesn't explain it. Smart dog," Irene said. "There are things that are lost that stay lost." Garrett knew this. He was not going to insult anyone's intelligence by suggesting otherwise. Claire was gone, and his team was scattered, and the years spent in service had left marks that did not simply fade because a dog pressed her face against his hand in a garden. He was not healed in the clean, completed sense he did not expect to be. But something had changed. He had begun to notice, over the course of that summer, that the house felt different. Not smaller or larger, but inhabited in a way it had not been since he moved in. The kitchen in the morning with the coffee going, and Frost asleep near the stove, the evening light coming through the west window in the particular amber way it had in early September. In Ontario, Bev's shepherd's pie dish, still sitting on the counter waiting to be returned, the scratch of Frost's nails on the wood floor, when she heard him moving before he'd fully gotten out of bed. The ordinary things, the things he'd thought he was done with. He had started writing letters. Not many, and not to people he'd been in touch with, but to his younger brother in Victoria, who he hadn't spoken to in almost 2 years, and to an old teammate named Porter Ashby, who had gotten out in 2019 and moved to Nova Scotia to build boats, which Garrett had thought at the time was eccentric, and now thought maybe he understood a little better. He wrote a long letter to Porter, and got a long letter back, full of dry jokes and descriptions of the Nova Scotia coast in winter that made it sound worth seeing. He thought maybe he would go see it, eventually. He thought about eventually in a different way now. In October, Frost did something that Garrett had no good explanation for. He had been having a bad week. The anniversary of Claire's death fell in the second week of October, and it always took something from him. Not cleanly, not all at once, but in small withdrawals across several days. He functioned. He kept to his routines. He was not the kind of man who fell apart in observable ways. But Frost knew. He didn't know how she knew. He had not changed his routines. He had not made any sounds that would have told her anything. But starting on the Monday and continuing through the week, she would not leave his side. Not demanding anything, not restless, not in the way of a dog who wants attention. Just beside him. A physical presence at the exact distance that was close without being intrusive. As though she had calculated precisely how much space he needed, and then occupied the remainder of it. On the Thursday evening he sat on the back porch steps in his jacket and looked out at the property in the dark, and Frost sat beside him, and after a while he put his arm around her and she leaned into him, and he sat like that for a long time. He wasn't certain whether it was the cold or something else that made his eyes water. He decided it didn't matter. The stars over Algonquin country in October are remarkable. He had forgotten this. He was remembering a lot of things he had forgotten. Bev came for Thanksgiving dinner, which Garrett cooked for the first time in years, and which turned out reasonably well by his assessment, and excellently well by hers, though he had learned to discount her generosity as a constant and adjust accordingly. Dale and Irene came too, and Dr. Ossie brought her husband, a quiet man named Bernard who worked in forestry and said little but laughed easily, and Teddy from the feed store appeared because Bev had mentioned it, and Teddy was constitutionally incapable of missing a social occasion. 7 people. 1 dog. Garrett stood in his kitchen with all of them and felt the old instinct to manage the situation like a tactical problem. Assess the room, control the variables, maintain the perimeter, and then let it go, because there was no perimeter to maintain here. There was just his kitchen, full of ordinary people eating turkey and talking over each other, and Frost moving between them with the quiet sociability she had recently discovered, accepting attention here and there with a measured dignity that Teddy described as kind of regal, actually, for a dog, and which Garrett thought was maybe just who she was. He thought about the dog he had found behind the deadfall in January, shaking so hard the cold was visible. He thought about himself in January, 3 years removed from Halifax, sealed off behind routines and distance, and the effortful invisibility he had mistaken for peace. He thought about what Dr. Ossie had said at the farmer's market. She looks present. He put dinner on the table, and people sat down, and someone passed the gravy, and Bernard made a quiet joke that made Irene laugh, and Garrett looked around at all of it, and felt the specific and irreducible weight of something worth keeping. The ice came back to the lake in December. He watched it form from the shore. Not at an event this time, just on a Tuesday morning walk with Frost. Watched the way it moved out from the edges and thickened in the cold, quiet and inevitable, and unmarked by ceremony. Frost stood beside him and watched too, her breath rising in small white clouds that the wind took east. She turned to look at him after a while, those 2 mismatched eyes settling on his face with that familiar attention, the look he had come to know as hers, the one that said, "I see you," not despite the silence or because of it. Just as a fact. He looked back. "Good girl," he said. She turned back to the lake. He stood beside her. The ice spread across the water, and the morning came on around them, and somewhere behind them the town of Merritt Falls was doing its quiet, ordinary business, and Garrett Phelan, who had spent 3 years learning how to disappear, stood on the shore of a frozen lake with a dog who had survived the winter and understood. Not as a grand conclusion, not as the end of a story, but as a thing he knew in his body the way you know the cold, that disappearing was no longer what he wanted. That was enough. For now, and maybe beyond now, that was exactly enough.